Right. So we've talked about the separation of powers, or the theory of the separation of powers, why they are separated and how they are separated and what could happen if they weren't separated. Now we're going to look at the Constitution, the Italian Constitution, and really analyse how they are in fact separated by the Constitution, by your constitutional document. And also compare it a little bit with how they're separated in England. Now, if we look in the Constitution, this is the second part of the Constitution, in Article 104. So the Article 104 talks about the magistratura. It says, la magistratura costituisce un ordine autonomo e indipendente da ogni altro potere. So we know it's clear that it's independent and autonomous. It works without any interference from other powers. For example, the legislative power like the Parliament, or the government, the executive power. So here we see the start of the clarity of your constitution, explaining that it is independent. But then in 105 it actually does something which makes it independent. It says, spetta noi il Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, secondo le norme dell'ordinamento giudiziario, le assunzioni, le assegnazioni e i trasferimenti, le promozioni e i provvedimenti disciplinari nei riguardi dei magistrati. Okay, so obviously it's independent from the other powers, but to be independent it must organise itself, and for that there is something over an organising organ, a constitutional organ, the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura, superiore because it's got power over this independent power, and they need to be taken on. Normally they're taken on, magistrates are taken on through concorsi, through public exams. They need to be disciplined. Sometimes they do things wrong, or maybe assigned specific cases, who maybe there's a big prosecution of the mafia and they need a judge, and this would be done through the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura. Obviously, if it was done through the political classes, if they could decide, who has, which magistrate judges, presides over a specific case, they might choose a very lenient one, or one with a reputation that's very severe, so they've got some influence there. And they don't want that. The Constitution doesn't want that. So it creates, it constitutes this Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura to be the organising organ which presides over the magistratura. In England, in the past, we had the Lord Chancellor, who was part of the government, ministers who chose judges, and that was deemed undemocratic because it didn't separate the powers enough, so the rule of law wasn't so obvious. And in 2005 the Parliament made a law that it's an independent body, so there's an independent commission presided over by judges, but also laymen, people who are not involved in the justice system, and so those are given they are given the power to choose and to choose magistrates, choose judges, and it's done by competition. The judges or potential judges compete for positions. Okay, so but here it's a little bit more obvious, the separation of power, because who in England, even the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court judges are nominated by the Queen on the advice of the Prime Minister. So normally the Prime Minister would be given a report by commissioners, an independent commission, but he is the one that advises the Queen and the Queen nominates. So it's a little less obvious, the separation of power. In England, we are structured in a different way. We have the royal family. We are a bit more structured like a family, where we've got a sovereign, which is the Queen at the moment, and with the power, the ultimate power, always resides in her. Even though this is more of a convention, she always does what the people want. But constitutionally, in theory, she is the sovereign. She is the one that decides and has executive power and also can have influence on nominating judges. But, we have this tradition. But Italy started again after the war and decided to make it very clear, this separation of power. The Parliament even can make laws on who decides who are to be the judges. There's no real written constitutional norm which is very difficult to override with an ordinary law. It's an ordinary law by Parliament, and they could decide quite easily. The politicians decide who the judges are and have done with all the separation of power. But they don't. There is this idea of the separation of power. It's just clearer in Italy. Also, for this separation between the judiciary and the political powers, the legislative powers, there is Article 107. If we read from Article 107, it says, I magistrati sono inamovibili, so they can't be moved. That gives them the freedom to speak their mind free of fear or favour. So there's no influence. They're not scared of being, sacked or disciplined, or maybe they're not receiving bribes, etc. They know they're unmovable, so they've got no fears. And it says, non possono essere dispensati o sospesi dal servizio né destinati ad altre sedi o funzioni se non in seguito a decisione del Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura. So the responsibility is the Consiglio Superiore della Magistratura always, if they are to be moved or manipulated in any ways. And then it says, adottato o per i motivi e con le garanzie di difesa stabilite dall'ordinamento giudiziario o con il loro consenso. Okay, so obviously they can do it, but the magistrates can defend themselves as established by the ordinamento giudiziario or with the consent of them. So there we have a very clear separation between these powers written in the Constitution. Also in the Constitution we can look at the parliamentary immunity. Parliamentary immunity gives a bit of separation of power. The politicians are not influenced by the magistrature, the judiciary, because they have this immunity up to a point. We'll have a look now. It says in Article 68, i membri del Parlamento non possono essere chiamati a rispondere delle opinioni espresse e dei voti dati nell'esercizio delle loro funzioni. So first of all, they can't be asked, expected to respond for what they say in the exercise of their functions. It used to be, in England, it's if the parliamentarians speak in Parliament, they cannot be asked, they cannot be sued, they cannot be taken to court and expected to pay damages for slander, for defamation. But outside the Parliament, they can't. But here, it's in the exercizio delle loro funzioni. So even if the politicians are in a TV studio saying things, they cannot be, they cannot have to respond for that. Maybe if there's defamation or some sort of, responsibility for what they've said or how they voted, they don't respond to that. They don't. The law cannot make them pay any consequences. Should we put it that way? For anything. There was a case, in fact, of a minister who was speaking in Parliament. I think it was the Lega Nord minister, and some member of Parliament cried out, "Murderer!" It was about the Iraq invasion, and he said, "You're a murderer," and because Italy had supported the invasion of Iraq, and that the person who shouted that in Parliament cannot be sued for saying that, because actually he was opening the debate. He was saying, right, shall we analyse, are you a murderer for doing this? So actually they need to be able to express themselves very fully, even though by doing that, in normal life, if you say you're a murderer, you could go to prison for defamation if you say it publicly. Here, they can say it publicly because it means they're not afraid to speak their mind, and they can widen the debate. They can analyse all lines of thought, etc. And the same for voting. They must be able to express their preference, and if their preference leads to terrible consequences, they cannot be asked to pay the penalty of those consequences, apart from not being voted in again, but any going to prison or paying damages for voting for something they shouldn't have voted for. They can't answer for that, because they are there to express, to vote for what they believe in on behalf of their constituents. So that's what that means. So first of all, we establish that they're protected from the judiciary on what they vote for and how they express themselves. Then it continues, senza autorizzazione della Camera alla quale appartiene, nessun membro del Parlamento può essere sottoposto a perquisizione personale o domiciliare, né può essere arrestato o altrimenti privato della libertà personale o mantenuto in detenzione. This is very important for the separation of power. We can imagine. So, yes, if it's authorised by the House can take responsibility, and it did with Salvini. Salvini had stopped the boat full of immigrants, 18, and that was, the procurator said, this is kidnap. This is, you can't do that. These are claiming refugee status. They're not illegal immigrants. You can't just keep them there for weeks. And so the House had to vote whether the procurator could arrest or detain Salvini and question him, etc. And they did. They said that it could go ahead, even though in the end it fell. They didn't continue. But there is this possibility, if the House believes there is an answer, the Member of Parliament should answer a question, maybe because otherwise it would bring it into question the reputation of the Parliament, this immunity. It shouldn't be right that it's a privilege, but it needs to exist to protect democracy. For example, if maybe there's a very, very important vote in Parliament, very controversial vote, and members of Parliament are travelling to Parliament to vote, and they're stopped by the police, and the police say, no, we've got to ask you all these questions, we're going to take you to the police station. Maybe they miss the vote, and that means all their constituents are excluded in their representation. So it would distort democracy. We could not understand really what the Parliament thought if one or more parliamentarians were detained for something else, even trivial, even something like a traffic thing. Maybe they were detained to question about an accident or something. This could change the destiny of the country if the vote didn't reach majority or didn't reach majority because of this influence. So it's very important that they can do their role, they can express fully and always their constituents, for their constituents, the will of their constituents, and the will of the Parliament is not distorted in any way. That's the big danger. But it does say later on, it continues salvo, so there is an exception, che in esecuzione di una sentenza irrevocabile di condanna, ovvero se sia colto nell'atto di commettere un delitto per il quale è previsto l'arresto obbligatorio in flagranza. So if they're caught red-handed doing something, if there's a body on the floor and they've got a knife in their hand, they can be arrested, because that would be previsto l'arresto obbligatorio in flagranza. So it would be a case where they should be arrested and detained. Or if they've already, the process has started, there's an execution, they've been found guilty, and there's an execution of a sentence. So if they've found guilty, they try to get to win and get a place in Parliament, they're not safe, because the decision's already been made, and just the sentence just needs to be carried out, so they can be detained in that specific case too.